My mother's last words weren't, "I love you." They weren't, "Be strong," or "I'll always be with you." No. What she whispered to me as she lay dying in that cold hospital room was something far worse. Something that would shatter every single thing I thought I knew about my life. She pulled me close with a strength I didn't think she had left, her fingers digging into my wrist like she was afraid I'd run before she could finish. And she said, "Your father never wanted to leave us. I made sure he had no choice." Then her grip loosened, her eyes closed, and 3 hours later, she was gone. I sat there frozen, staring at her pale face, trying to convince myself I'd heard wrong. The machines around us had been beeping steadily for hours, creating this rhythmic soundtrack to what was supposed to be a sacred moment between mother and daughter. But there was nothing sacred about what she just told me, nothing peaceful. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A nurse walked past the door, her shoes squeaking against the linoleum. My mother's chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. And all I could think was, what does she mean? What choice? My father left when I was 7 years old. He abandoned us. That's what I'd been told my entire life. He walked out one morning and never came back. My mother raised me alone, sacrificing everything, working 2 jobs, keeping us afloat when the world tried to drag us under. That was the story. That was my truth. But now, sitting there holding her cold hand, I realized I'd never actually asked him why he left. I'd never reached out. I'd never questioned the narrative, because my mother's version was all I'd ever needed. She was my hero, the woman who stayed, the woman who fought for me when everyone else walked away. Except now, with those final words still echoing in my head, I was starting to wonder if maybe I'd been living inside a carefully constructed lie my entire life. I looked down at her face, peaceful now, all the tension gone. She looked like the mother I'd always known, the woman who braided my hair before school, who made me soup when I was sick, who told me every single day that I was her whole world. But who was she really? And more terrifying than that, who was I if everything I believed about my own story was wrong? 3 days later, I stood in a black dress at the front of a small funeral home, shaking hands with people who kept telling me how sorry they were for my loss, how strong my mother was, how much she sacrificed, how lucky I was to have had her. I smiled. I nodded. I said thank you so many times the words stopped meaning anything. But inside, I was screaming. Because every single person who spoke at that funeral told the same story. The story of the devoted single mother. The woman who gave up everything for her daughter after being abandoned by a selfish man. My Aunt Diane spoke first, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, talking about how my mother never complained, never asked for help, just did what needed to be done. My mother's best friend, Carol, went next, her voice breaking as she described the early years after my father left, how my mother would work double shifts and still show up to every school event, exhausted but smiling. Even Father Mitchell, who barely knew us, painted this picture of maternal sainthood that made my stomach turn. I wanted to stand up and scream. I wanted to tell them all that maybe, just maybe, they didn't know the whole story. That my mother's last words had cracked open something dark and complicated that didn't fit into their neat narrative. But I didn't. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, staring at the closed casket, wondering how you're supposed to grieve someone when you're not even sure who they were. The funeral home smelled like lilies and furniture polish. Soft organ music played from hidden speakers. Everything was designed to be comforting, peaceful, respectful. But all I felt was rage mixed with guilt, mixed with this horrible, suffocating confusion. Because I did love her. God, I loved her so much. She was my whole world for 28 years. Every decision I made thinking about her. Every choice, every sacrifice, every time I stayed home instead of taking a risk, it was because she taught me that the world was dangerous and family was all that mattered. But what if that teaching was a cage? What if her love was a leash? I looked around the room at all these people crying for a woman they thought they knew, and I realized I was the only one sitting there wondering if we'd all been fooled. After the service, people lined up to hug me, to tell me I looked just like her, to remind me that I was her legacy. Mrs. Patterson from across the street grabbed my hands and said, "Your mother's love for you was the purest thing I've ever seen. She lived for you." And I smiled and thanked her, even though those words felt like glass in my throat. Because what if that was the problem? What if she didn't just live for me? What if she lived through me? What if I was never allowed to be my own person because being her daughter was the only identity she'd let me have?
I started going through her things 2 weeks after the funeral. I know you're supposed to wait, supposed to give yourself time to grieve before you sort through a dead person's belongings. But I couldn't. I needed answers. I needed to know if what she'd said was real or just the confused ramblings of a dying mind. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it. The dishes were still in the drying rack. Her reading glasses sat on the coffee table next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. Her favorite blanket was draped over the back of the couch. It felt wrong being there without her, like I was trespassing in someone else's life. I started in her bedroom, opening drawers and closets, not even sure what I was looking for. Old clothes, costume jewelry, stacks of books with dog-eared pages, nothing unusual, nothing that screamed secret life. But then I found it. A shoebox pushed to the back of her closet underneath a pile of winter scarves. My hands were shaking as I pulled it out. I don't know why, but I knew before I even opened it that whatever was inside would change everything. I sat down on her bed, the same bed where she used to let me crawl in next to her when I had nightmares, and I lifted the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some opened, some still sealed. I pulled out the first one, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The return address made my breath catch. It was from my father, dated 12 years ago. I'd been 16. I unfolded the yellowed paper with trembling fingers and started to read. My dearest daughter, I'm writing this even though I know your mother will never let you see it. I've tried so many times to reach you. I've called, I've written, I've even driven past your school hoping to catch a glimpse of you. But your mother has made it clear that I'm not welcome in your life. I don't know what she's told you about me. I don't know what story she's created to explain my absence. But I need you to know that I never wanted to leave you. I fought for you. I begged for the chance to be your father. And when the court said no, when the system believed her over me, I didn't give up. I kept trying. I'm still trying. Even now, even though you probably hate me, even though you probably don't even remember what I look like, I'm still your father and I still love you. I read it 3 times. Then I pulled out another letter and another. They were all the same, desperate pleas from a man I'd been taught to hate, a man I'd been told abandoned me without a second thought. But these letters didn't sound like abandonment. They sounded like desperation, like someone fighting against an invisible war. I looked at the dates. They spanned 15 years. The most recent one was from just 8 months ago. He'd never stopped trying, and my mother had kept every single letter hidden from me. I sat there on her bed, surrounded by evidence of a lie that lasted my entire life, and I felt something crack inside my chest. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was betrayal. It was rage. It was the horrible realization that the person I trusted most in the world had been lying to me for 28 years. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my own bed, staring at the ceiling, and suddenly, every memory from my childhood started playing in my head like a horror movie where you finally understand what the monster was all along. I remembered being 8 years old,
coming home from school excited because my teacher said she'd gotten a call from someone claiming to be my father, asking about my progress. My mother's face had gone white. She'd grabbed my shoulders, her fingers digging in, and said, "If anyone ever approaches you saying they are your father, you run, you scream, you find a teacher or a police officer. Do you understand me? He's dangerous." I'd nodded, terrified, believing her completely. Now I understood. He'd been trying to reach me even then, and she turned him into a monster to keep me afraid. I remembered being 13, sobbing because we had to move again. It was the third time in 5 years. I'd finally made real friends. I had a life. But my mother said we had no choice, that it wasn't safe, that people were asking too many questions. I believed her. I packed my things and said goodbye to Sarah Mitchell, my best friend who'd cried and begged me to stay in touch. I never did. My mother said it was better to make clean breaks, that holding on to the past only caused pain. Now I realized we weren't running from danger, we were running from him. Every time he got close to finding us, she'd uproot our entire lives, and I'd gone along with it because I trusted her, because she was my mother, and mothers protect their children, right? I remembered being 17. I'd been working so hard in school, staying up late every night because I wanted to go to college. I wanted to study journalism. I wanted to write stories and travel and see the world beyond the small towns we kept hiding in. My guidance counselor said I had a real shot at scholarships. She said universities would be interested in someone with my grades and my background. I was so excited. I'd come home and tell my mother about my plans, and she'd smile, but there was something in her eyes, something I'd interpreted as worry, as love, as the natural fear a mother has when her child talks about leaving. But now I wondered if it was something else. If it was fear of a different kind. Fear that if I left, if I had my own life, she'd lose control of the narrative. She'd lose control of me. And then there was the car accident. We'd been driving home from the grocery store. It was raining. She'd swerved suddenly, hit a guardrail. Nothing serious, some bruises, a totaled car. But afterwards, she'd become even more protective, said I needed to stay home, recover, that the world was too dangerous. I'd missed weeks of school, and when I finally went back, my counselor had this strange look on her face. She said she tried to reach me, that there'd been some letters, but my mother said I was dealing with trauma and couldn't handle additional stress. I hadn't questioned it. Why would I? But now, lying in the dark with those letters burning a hole in my consciousness, I had to ask myself, was that accident really an accident? Or was it just another way to keep me close? Another way to make sure I never left her? Another way to cut me off from opportunities that might lead me to the truth? I called my Aunt Diane the next morning. We'd never been close. She'd always been cold to me, distant, and I'd assumed it was just her personality. But now I wondered if there was more to it. She answered on the 5th ring, her voice cautious. "Hello?" I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "And Diane, I need to know the truth about my father." There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear her breathing, could almost feel her deciding whether to hang up or finally break. "What did your mother tell you?" she finally asked. "She told me he abandoned us. But I found letters, dozens of them. He never stopped trying to contact me." Another silence. Then, "Can you come over? This isn't a conversation for the phone." An hour later, I sat in her kitchen, drinking tea I didn't want, watching her struggle to find words. She was older than my mother by 3 years, her face lined with a weariness that went beyond age. Finally, she spoke. "Your father was a good man. Is a good man. I never understood why your mother did what she did." My hands tightened around the mug. "What did she do?" Diane looked at me with something like pity. "She lied in court, said he was abusive, said he threatened both of you, said you were terrified of him. None of it was true, but she was convincing. She had bruises, she had this whole story, and the judge believed her." I felt sick. "But why? Why would she do that?" Diane shook her head. Your mother had issues, deep ones. She grew up in a home where love meant control. Her father kept her mother isolated, afraid, dependent. When your mother met your father, he was different, kind, gentle. He wanted her to have her own life, her own friends, her own career. And I think that terrified her. She didn't know how to exist without someone needing her completely. And when you were born, it got worse. She became obsessed with the idea that everyone was trying to take you away from her. Your father wanted joint custody when they separated. He wanted you to have both parents, but she couldn't handle that. She needed you to need only her. The room felt like it was spinning. So everything was a lie? Everything? Diane reached across the table, her hand covering mine. The love wasn't a lie. She loved you more than anything, but her love was sick. It was suffocating. And when your father fought for custody, when he refused to just disappear like she wanted, she made sure he had no legal ground to stand on. She destroyed his reputation. She moved you across state lines. She changed your last name. She did everything she could to erase him from your life. I pulled my hand back. And you just let her? You watched her do this and said nothing? Diane's eyes filled with tears. I tried. God, I tried. I threatened to tell you the truth. She cut me out of your life completely. That's why you barely know me. That's why I wasn't around when you were growing up. She said if I ever contacted you, if I ever tried to expose her, she'd make sure you believed I was trying to destroy your family out of jealousy. And I believed her because your mother was the most convincing liar I've ever known.
I drove home in a daze. The streets looked different. The sky looked different. Everything looked different when you realize your entire life had been built on a foundation of lies. I kept thinking about all the times my mother had held me, told me she loved me, told me we only had each other. And I believed it was devotion. I believed it was sacrifice. I believed it was the purest form of love a mother could give. But now I had to face the possibility that it was never about love. Or maybe it was about love, but a twisted, damaged version of love that looks more like possession than protection. How do you grieve someone who loved you and hurt you at the same time? How do you hold both truths in your heart without breaking? I thought about my father, out there somewhere, living a life I knew nothing about, carrying the weight of being called a monster by the only woman he'd ever loved, losing his daughter to a lie he couldn't fight, writing letters he knew would never be read. And I thought about myself at 7 years old, crying for a daddy who never came back, not understanding why, just knowing that I must not have been good enough to make him stay. My mother had let me believe that, had let me grow up thinking I was unlovable to the one man who was supposed to love me unconditionally. And that realization hurt more than anything else. Because she didn't just steal my father from me, she stole my sense of worth. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car, engine off, staring at nothing. My phone was in my hand. I had his number now, and Diane had given it to me before I left. He'll answer, she'd said. He's been waiting for this call your whole life. But I couldn't do it yet, because calling him meant accepting that everything I'd believed was wrong. It meant grieving the mother I thought I had while meeting the woman she actually was. It meant starting over, rebuilding my identity from scratch, figuring out who I was when I wasn't just her daughter, her project, her reason for living. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. But I would be. Because if my mother's last words taught me anything, it's that truth has a way of surfacing even when people try to bury it, even when it hurts more than the lie ever did. So here's what I need to know, what I need you to think about as I continue this story. If the person who loved you most in the world was also the person who hurt you most, would you choose comfortable lies or painful truth? And once you knew the truth, would you ever be able to forgive them, or would you spend the rest of your life wondering who you could have been if they just let you go?
I stared at his number for 3 days before I finally called. 3 days of picking up my phone, dialing the first few digits, then hanging up in panic. 3 days of rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd introduce myself, whether I should apologize or accuse or just ask why.
But every script I wrote in my head sounded wrong. Because how do you talk to a ghost? How do you call someone who's been dead to you for 21 years and say, "Hi, it's your daughter, the one you supposedly abandoned, except I just found out you didn't actually abandon me, you are erased." On the fourth day, I didn't let myself think. I just pressed call before my brain could stop my fingers. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I was about to hang up when a voice answered. "Hello?" It was deep, warm, cautious. My throat closed up. I couldn't speak. "Hello? Is someone there?" He sounded older than I'd imagined, tired. But there was something in his tone that made my chest ache, something gentle, something that sounded like it had been waiting. "It's me," I finally whispered. "It's Clara." The silence that followed was so heavy I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard him breathe, this sharp intake of air like he'd been punched. "Clara? My Clara?" His voice broke on my name, and suddenly I was crying, ugly, sobbing tears that I couldn't control. "I found your letters," I managed to say between gasps. "I found all of them. Why didn't you try harder? Why didn't you fight for me?" I knew it was unfair even as I said it, but I needed someone to blame, and he was there and my mother wasn't. "I did fight," he said, and now he was crying too. "God, Clara, I fought so hard. I spent years in court. I hired lawyers I couldn't afford. I drove past your schools hoping to see you. I sent letters, gifts, cards. Everything came back. Your mother moved you every time I got close. She had restraining orders. She had documentation. She made it impossible." His words came out in a rush, like he'd been holding them in for decades and finally had permission to release them. "I never stopped thinking about you, not for a single day. I have a whole room in my house dedicated to you. Pictures I managed to get from your schools, report cards I convinced secretaries to copy for me. I watched you grow up in fragments, installing glimpses, always from a distance, because that was all she'd allow." I pressed my hand against my mouth to muffle the sound of my crying. "She told me you didn't want me. She said you walked away and never looked back." "I know," he said softly. "I know that's what she told you. And I'm so sorry you believed that for so long. I'm sorry I couldn't reach you. I'm sorry you grew up thinking your father didn't love you, when loving you was the only thing that kept me going through all those years." We stayed on the phone for 2 hours, not saying much after that initial flood, just breathing together, just existing in the same moment for the first time in 21 years. And when we finally hung up, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not relief, not closure, but a different kind of grief. The grief of meeting your father as a stranger and realizing how much time you'd lost.
Meeting him in person was harder. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop halfway between our cities, neutral territory. I got there early and sat by the window, my hands shaking so badly I had to put my coffee down before I spilled it. I'd looked up photos of him online, so I knew what to expect. But when he walked through the door, when I saw his face in real life for the first time since I was 7 years old, something in me collapsed. He looked like me. Or I looked like him. Same eyes, same nose, same way of standing, like we weren't quite sure we belonged in the space we occupied. He saw me immediately and stopped, his hand going to his chest like he needed to steady his heart. Then he walked over, slowly, carefully, like I might disappear if he moved too fast. "Clara," he said my name like a prayer. We sat down across from each other, neither of us knowing how to start. Finally, he pulled out a folder. "I brought this for you. I thought you might want to see them." Inside were photos. Me as a baby in his arms. Me taking my first steps while he knelt nearby with his arms outstretched. Me at my 4th birthday party, sitting on his shoulders, both of us laughing. I didn't remember any of it. My mother had erased every trace of him from our home, every photo, every memory, every piece of evidence that he'd once been part of my life. "I was there," he said quietly, pointing to each picture. "I was there for every moment I was allowed to be." And then she filed for divorce and everything changed. I looked up at him. "Tell me what really happened. I need to know everything."
He nodded and began to talk. He told me about the marriage falling apart, not because of abuse or infidelity, but because my mother couldn't handle him having his own life. She wanted him home every night. She'd call his work constantly, accusing him of cheating when he worked late. She'd go through his phone, his emails, his car. When he suggested therapy, she said he was trying to make her look crazy. When he suggested separation, she told him he'd never see me again. He didn't believe her. He thought the courts would see reason. He was wrong. She showed up with bruises she'd given herself. She had a diary full of fabricated abuse. She coached witnesses, and the judge believed every word, because who would make up something like that about the father of their child? But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part came when he opened another folder and handed me a letter. It was from Hatfield University, one of the best journalism programs in the country, addressed to me. Dated 7 years ago when I was 17. "How did you get this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Your guidance counselor, Mrs. Chen, she found me. She said your mother told her you decided not to pursue college, that you needed to stay home for family reasons. But Mrs. Chen didn't believe it. She'd seen how hard you worked. She knew how badly you wanted this, so she tracked me down and gave me a copy." I opened the letter with trembling hands and read the words that should have changed my life. "Congratulations, Clara. We are pleased to offer you a full scholarship." I couldn't finish reading. The paper fell from my hands as the full weight of what my mother had done crashed over me. She hadn't just kept my father away. She'd stolen my future. She'd intercepted this letter, told the university I wasn't interested, and then staged a car accident to justify keeping me home. I'd spent the last 7 years working dead-end jobs, living in a tiny apartment, putting my dreams on hold because I thought I hadn't been good enough, because I thought no one wanted me. But they had wanted me, they'd chosen me, and my mother had thrown it away like it was nothing. Why? I looked at my father, tears streaming down my face. Why would she do that? He reached across the table and took my hand. Because letting you leave meant losing control. And for your mother, control was the only way she knew how to love. Over the next few weeks, I started piecing together the full pattern of my mother's control, and it was worse than I'd imagined. Every significant moment in my life, every opportunity, every relationship, every choice that mattered had been manipulated. I thought I was unlucky. I thought I was the problem. But it was never me. It was always her, operating behind the scenes, pulling strings I didn't even know existed. I started making a list because I needed to see it written down. I needed proof that I wasn't going crazy. First, there was Sarah Mitchell, my best friend from middle school. We'd been inseparable until suddenly we went. One day, she stopped talking to me completely. I thought I'd done something wrong. I'd cried for weeks trying to understand what had happened. Now, I found Sarah on social media and sent her a message. She responded within an hour. "Your mom called my parents and told them you are being bullied, and she wanted to limit your social interactions for your mental health. She said you needed space. My parents made me stop contacting you. I tried to reach out a few times, but your number was always disconnected. I thought you didn't want to be friends anymore." Then there was Marcus, my high school boyfriend. Sweet, kind Marcus who treated me like I mattered. We dated for 6 months before my mother convinced me he was dangerous. She'd shown me evidence of him talking to other girls, told me she'd seen him following me, said his family had a history of violence. I'd broken up with him, devastated, believing I'd narrowly escaped something terrible. I found him on Facebook. He was married now, living upstate, working as a teacher. I sent him a message apologizing for how things ended. His response made me sick. "Clara, I never understood what happened. Your mom called me one night and said if I didn't stay away from you, she'd file a police report claiming I'd assaulted you. I was 17. I was terrified. I wanted to warn you, but I didn't know how without making things worse. I'm sorry I just disappeared." Every relationship I tried to build, my mother systematically destroyed. every friendship, every romantic connection, every mentor who'd taken interest in me had been scared away or convinced I was troubled, fragile, in need of isolation. She'd created a world where I had no one but her, where every door that opened, she quietly closed, where every hand that reached out to help me, she slapped away. And I'd never known. I'd walked through life thinking I was socially awkward, unlucky in love, not meant for close connections, when the truth was I'd been sabotaged at every turn by the one person who claimed to love me most. But it wasn't just relationships, it was opportunities, jobs I'd applied for and never heard back from, internships I'd been rejected from despite meeting all the qualifications. I started making calls, reaching out to HR department, asking questions, and slowly a horrifying picture emerged. My mother had called employers claiming I had mental health issues. She'd told internship coordinators I was unreliable. She'd written emails from fake accounts warning universities that I was unstable. She'd destroyed my reputation before I'd even had a chance to build one. And she'd done it all in the name of protection, in the name of keeping me safe, in the name of love. I sat in my apartment, surrounded by evidence of her betrayal, and I realized something that made my blood run cold. My mother hadn't raised me to be independent, she'd raised me to need her. She'd spent 28 years making sure I could never survive without her. And now that she was gone, I had to figure out how to live in a world I'd never been prepared for.
I went back to Diane's house a week later because I needed more answers. I needed to understand how deep this went. She welcomed me in with the same sad, tired expression she'd had before. This time, I didn't wait for tea and pleasantries. "How long did you know?" I asked as soon as we sat down. "How long did you know what she was doing to me?" Diane's face crumpled. "Too long," she whispered. "I knew from the beginning. I saw how she was with you, even when you were a baby. She wouldn't let anyone else hold you. She'd panic if you were out of her sight for even a moment. Your father would try to take you for a walk and she'd follow behind, insisting something terrible would happen. At first, I thought it was just new mother anxiety, but it got worse. She told me things I wish I didn't know. How my mother had always been unstable, even as a child. How their father had kept their mother locked in the house, isolated from friends and family, convinced that the outside world was dangerous and only he could keep her safe. How their mother had eventually tried to escape with them and their father had reported her as mentally unstable, gotten her institutionalized, and kept the children as proof of his righteousness. Your mother watched our mother lose everything trying to be free, Diane said, her voice shaking. And instead of learning that control is abuse, she learned that control is survival. She learned that if you love someone, you never let them go. You never give them the chance to leave you. I felt sick. So I was just repeating a cycle? I was just another prisoner in a family tradition of captivity? Diane shook her head. You were her chance to do it right. In her mind, she wasn't imprisoning you. She was protecting you from the pain of abandonment, from the pain our mother experienced, from the pain she experienced when your father tried to have his own life outside of her. She genuinely believed that keeping you close, keeping you dependent, was the most loving thing she could do. I stood up and started pacing. But it wasn't love, Diane. Love doesn't destroy people. Love doesn't steal their futures. Love doesn't lie and manipulate and sabotage. I know, Diane said quietly. I know that now. But your mother couldn't see the difference. She couldn't separate love from possession. And by the time I realized how bad it had gotten, you were already so deep in her world that trying to pull you out would have destroyed you. She'd made herself your entire universe. If I told you the truth when you were younger, you wouldn't have believed me, because that's what she trained you to think about anyone who questioned her. I stopped pacing and looked at her. You could have tried. Diane's eyes filled with tears. You are right. I should have tried harder. I should have fought for you the way your father fought for you. But I was afraid. I was a coward, and I've lived with that guilt every single day for the past 15 years. We sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, I asked the question I'd been avoiding. Did she know she was hurting me, or did she really believe she was helping? Diane looked at me with such sadness that I almost regretted asking. Both, she said.
That's the tragedy of it. She loved you more than anything in the world, and that love was so twisted, so damaged by her own trauma, that it became the very thing that hurt you most. She died believing she'd been the perfect mother, that she'd saved you from all the pain she experienced. She never saw herself as the villain in your story. She saw herself as the hero.
I couldn't go back to my mother's apartment for 3 weeks after that conversation. Every time I thought about finishing the task of sorting through her things, my stomach would turn. But eventually, the landlord called, saying I needed to clear out the space. So I forced myself to go back, to walk into that apartment that smelled like her perfume and her lies, and finish what I'd started. I'd only gotten through her bedroom last time. Now I had to face the rest of the apartment. The living room, the kitchen, the closet by the front door that she'd always kept locked. I'd asked about it once when I was a teenager. She'd said it was just storage for holiday decorations, nothing important. But she'd kept the only key on a chain around her neck, even while she slept. Now that key was in my possession, along with all her other belongings. I stood in front of that closet door for 10 minutes before I finally unlocked it. Inside wasn't holiday decorations. Inside was my entire life, carefully documented and controlled. There were file folders organized by year. I pulled out the one labeled with the year I turned 17. Inside were college acceptance letters, not just from Hartfield, from 6 different universities, all offering scholarships, all accepting me into their programs, all sent back with polite declinations my mother had forged with my signature. There were job offers from internships I didn't know I'd applied for, or rather, internships my guidance counselor had applied to on my behalf, trying to give me opportunities my mother kept stealing. Each one had a rejection letter my mother had written, claiming I was dealing with family emergencies and couldn't participate. There was more. A folder full of letters from my father's lawyer documenting his attempts to get visitation rights, to get custody, to simply be allowed to send me birthday cards. Each legal document showed my mother's counterclaims, detailed account of abuse that never happened, witness statements from people I'd never met, medical reports from doctors who'd apparently documented injuries I'd never had. She'd built an entire fictional narrative, a complete alternate reality, and convinced the legal system it was truth. But what destroyed me most was the journal. Red leather, worn at the edges, filled with her handwriting. I sat down on her floor and started reading. The entries spanned 25 years. They started hopeful, excited about being a new mother. Then they shifted, became paranoid, obsessive. She smiled at a stranger today at the grocery store. What if he tries to take her? What if everyone is trying to take her? I need to be more careful. I need to keep her closer. The entries documented every decision she'd made. The school transfers. Clara was getting too attached to that teacher. Teachers always think they know better than mothers. Time to move. The intercepted scholarship letters. She can't leave me. Not yet. Not ever. If she goes away to college, she'll meet people who will turn her against me. She'll forget how much I've sacrificed. Better she stays home where I can protect her. The car accident. The brakes worked fine. I just needed to make a point. Show her the world is dangerous. Show her she needs me. That line made me drop the journal. My hands were shaking. My mother had deliberately crashed our car. She'd risked both our lives just to manufacture a reason to keep me home, just to create fear, just to maintain control. I kept reading through tears. The later entries were worse. They showed no remorse, no self-awareness, just continued justification. I know she thinks I'm overprotective, but one day she'll understand. One day she'll thank me for keeping her safe from all the people who would have hurt her, from her father who would have filled her head with ideas about freedom and independence, from friends who would have betrayed her, from opportunities that would have taken her away from me. I saved her from all of it. I gave her the greatest gift a mother can give: complete, unconditional, unbreakable love. I closed the journal and sat there in that closet, surrounded by the evidence of my mother's madness, and I finally understood. She hadn't been evil, she'd been sick, deeply, profoundly sick, and I was the collateral damage.
Meeting him in person was harder. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop halfway between our cities, neutral territory. I got there early and sat by the window, my hands shaking so badly I had to put my coffee down before I spilled it. I'd looked up photos of him online, so I knew what to expect. But when he walked through the door, when I saw his face in real life for the first time since I was 7 years old, something in me collapsed. He looked like me, or I looked like him. Same eyes, same nose, same way of standing, like we weren't quite sure we belonged in the space we occupied. He saw me immediately and stopped, his hand going to his chest like he needed to steady his heart. Then he walked over, slowly, carefully, like I might disappear if he moved too fast. Clara, he said my name like a prayer. We sat down across from each other, neither of us knowing how to start. Finally, he pulled out a folder. I brought this for you. I thought you might want to see them. Inside were photos. Me as a baby in his arms. Me taking my first steps while he knelt nearby with his arms outstretched. Me at my 4th birthday party, sitting on his shoulders, both of us laughing. I didn't remember any of it. My mother had erased every trace of him from our home. Every photo, every memory, every piece of evidence that he'd once been part of my life. I was there, he said quietly, pointing to each picture. I was there for every moment I was allowed to be. And then she filed for divorce and everything changed. I looked up at him. Tell me what really happened. I need to know everything. He nodded and began to talk. He told me about the marriage falling apart, not because of abuse or infidelity, but because my mother couldn't handle him having his own life. She wanted him home every night. She'd call his work constantly, accusing him of cheating when he worked late. She'd go through his phone, his emails, his car. When he suggested therapy, she said he was trying to make her look crazy. When he suggested separation, she told him he'd never see me again. He didn't believe her. He thought the courts would see reason. He was wrong. She showed up with bruises she'd given herself. She had a diary full of fabricated abuse. She coached witnesses, and the judge believed every word, because who would make up something like that about the father of their child? But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part came when he opened another folder and handed me a letter. It was from Hatfield University, one of the best journalism programs in the country, addressed to me. Dated 7 years ago when I was 17. How did you get this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Your guidance counselor, Mrs. Chen, she found me. She said your mother told her you decided not to pursue college, that you needed to stay home for family reasons. But Mrs. Chen didn't believe it. She'd seen how hard you worked. She knew how badly you wanted this, so she tracked me down and gave me a copy. I opened the letter with trembling hands and read the words that should have changed my life. Congratulations, Clara. We are pleased to offer you a full scholarship. I couldn't finish reading. The paper fell from my hands as the full weight of what my mother had done crashed over me. She hadn't just kept my father away. She'd stolen my future. She'd intercepted this letter, told the university I wasn't interested, and then staged a car accident to justify keeping me home. I'd spent the last 7 years working dead-end jobs, living in a tiny apartment, putting my dreams on hold because I thought I hadn't been good enough, because I thought no one wanted me. But they had wanted me, they'd chosen me, and my mother had thrown it away like it was nothing. Why? I looked at my father, tears streaming down my face. Why would she do that? He reached across the table and took my hand. Because letting you leave meant losing control. And for your mother, control was the only way she knew how to love.
Grief is supposed to be simple. Someone you love dies. You cry. You remember the good times. You slowly heal. That's what everyone tells you. That's what all the sympathy cards say. Time heals all wounds. She's in a better place. Hold on to the happy memories. But what do you do when the happy memories are poisoned? When every moment you treasured is now tainted by the knowledge of what was happening behind the scenes? I'd spent weeks trying to grieve my mother the normal way. I would look at old photos and try to feel the warmth I used to feel. Me and her at my 8th grade graduation, her teaching me to bake cookies, us laughing together over some stupid TV show. But now, when I looked at those photos, all I could see was the manipulation. In that graduation photo, she just transferred me to a new school to cut me off from a teacher who then encouraged me to apply for a writing competition. Those cookies we baked together were the same day she convinced me to cancel plans with friends because family time was more important. That TV show we watched was her way of keeping me home instead of letting me go to a school dance. Every memory had two versions now. The version I'd lived, where my mother was loving and protective, and the version I now understood, where every act of love was also an act of control. How do you mourn someone when you're not sure which version was real, or if either version was real? I tried talking to a grief counselor. She was kind, patient, said all the right therapeutic things. But when I told her my story, when I explained about the letters and the lies and the manufactured accidents, she got this look on her face. This confused, uncomfortable look like she didn't know which script to follow. Was I a grieving daughter or a freed prisoner? Was this a loss or a liberation? The answer was both, and she didn't have tools for both. So I stopped going. I tried talking to friends, but I didn't really have friends. My mother had made sure of that. The few acquaintances I had didn't know what to see. They'd met my mother. She seemed so normal to them, so devoted. They couldn't reconcile the woman who'd brought cookies to my workplace with the woman who'd forged rejection letters to keep me trapped. So they'd say things like, I'm sure she thought she was doing the right thing, or she loved you in her own way, and I'd want to scream because yes, she loved me, but her love had destroyed me, and those two truths couldn't coexist in the same sentence without making me feel like I was losing my mind. The worst part was nighttime. During the day, I could stay busy. I could go through her things, make phone calls, investigate the past. But at night, when everything was quiet, I would lie in bed and remember how she used to check on me before she went to sleep. How she'd crack open my door, whisper, I love you. And I would feel so safe, so protected. That memory hadn't changed. The physical act was the same, but the meaning behind it was completely different. She wasn't checking on me because she loved me. She was checking on me because she needed to know I was still there, still hers, still trapped in the life she'd constructed. And I missed her anyway. That was the most painful part. Despite everything, despite all the lies and manipulation and stolen opportunities, I missed my mother. I missed the sound of her voice. I missed calling her when something good happened. I missed having someone who I thought understood me better than anyone. And I hated myself for missing her. Because how do you miss your captor? How do you grieve for the architect of your prison?
My father and I started meeting regularly. Coffee shops, restaurants, parks, neutral spaces where we could try to build something from the ruins of what should have been. He was patient with me, never pushing, always letting me set the pace. But I could see the pain in his eyes every time I called him sir instead of dad, or when I instinctively pulled away if he moved too close. We were strangers, learning each other, except we shouldn't have been strangers at all. One afternoon, we were sitting by a lake, and I finally asked him the question that had been eating at me. How did you survive it? Losing me, believing I hated you. How did you not just give up? He was quiet for a long time, watching the water. Then he said, there were days I wanted to. Days when the pain of missing you was so intense I didn't think I could take another breath. I'd drive past playgrounds and see fathers with their daughters, and I'd have to pull over because I couldn't see through my tears. I went to therapy. I joined support groups for parents who'd been alienated from their children. I wrote you letters I knew you'd never read just so I could feel like I was talking to you. And I held on to this small, stubborn hope that one day, somehow, you'd know the truth. He turned to look at me. I survived because giving up would have meant she won. It would have meant accepting that love could be erased, that our bond meant nothing, that all those years I held you and raised you and loved you could just be deleted like they never happened. And I couldn't accept that. So I kept living, kept hoping, kept believing that truth has a way of surfacing even when people try to bury it. I felt tears running down my face. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I believed her. I'm sorry I never questioned it. I'm sorry I let 21 years pass without ever trying to find you. He reached over and took my hand. You have nothing to apologize for. You were a child. She was your mother. Of course you believed her. That's what children do. They trust the people who raised them. The betrayal is hers, not yours. But I couldn't accept that absolution because part of me felt like I should have known, should have sensed something was wrong, should have questioned why my father would abandon me without a word, without an explanation, without even a goodbye. But I didn't question it because questioning my mother felt like betrayal, and she'd raised me to believe that loyalty to her was the highest virtue. Tell me about the real story, not the custody battle, not the legal stuff. Tell me about us, about who we were before she took that away. So he did. He told me about how I used to fall asleep on his chest while he read to me, how I'd make him play tea party for hours and he'd sit there with a tiny plastic cup pretending to drink invisible tea because making me happy was the best part of his day. How I'd cry when he left for work and run to the door when he came home. How my first word was dada and my mother had been so jealous she'd spent weeks trying to get me to say mama first, even though it was too late. He told me about the day she filed for divorce, how she'd waited until he was at work, packed up all my things and disappeared. How he'd come home to an empty house and a note that said, "You'll never see her again." How he thought she was bluffing until the restraining order arrived. How he'd realized too late that she was serious, that she'd rather destroy our family than share me with anyone, even my own father. I lost 7 years of your childhood, he said, his voice breaking. 7 years of watching you grow up. First days of school, lost teeth, learning to ride a bike. All of it gone because she couldn't handle not being the only person in your universe. We sat there crying together. Two people grieving the same loss from different angles. Him mourning the daughter he couldn't raise, me mourning the father I never knew I had, and both of us hating the woman who'd caused this wound while simultaneously understanding that she'd been wounded too. That hurt people, that trauma creates trauma, that my mother's cruelty came from a place of pain so deep she couldn't see past it. But understanding didn't equal forgiveness, and grief didn't erase anger. We could acknowledge her pain while still holding her accountable for ours.